often rebuked, yet always back returning to those first feelings that were born with me, and leaving busy chase of wealth and learning for idle dreams of things which cannot be. Today I will seek the shadowy region, its unsustaining vastness waxes drear, and visions rising, legion after legion, bring the unreal world too strangely near. I'll walk, but not in old heroic traces, and not in paths of high morality, and not among the half-distinguished faces, the clouded forms of long past history. I'll walk where my own nature would be leading. It vexes me to choose another guide, where the grey flocks in ferny glens are feeding, where the wild wind blows on the mountainside. What have those lonely mountains worth revealing? More glory and more grief than I can tell. The earth that wakes one human heart to feeling can centre both the worlds of heaven and hell. I tried my best to make the rankings video as entertaining and enjoyable as the last 3 wives, but still it was very much scraping the bottom of the barrel experience trying to get above 5 segments. The policy on this channel is a historical figure has to have at least 5 on-screen counterparts in order to warrant a rankings video. If it weren't for Horrible Histories and Six the Musical, Anna would barely qualify. Nevertheless, her legacy as a wife of Henry VIII allows her to have a definitive moment. But strangely enough, this is the moment that all but one of her on-screen counterparts get wrong. And why is that? Sometimes for comedy, sometimes because of time constraints, and other times, well, maybe they don't care. And I think the way Anna's definitive moment has been often misrepresented underlines a trend in writing a female character who doesn't have a dramatic end, can't be used for sex appeal, and can't be used as a motivation for the protagonist. Let's get into this. In today's Western culture, arranged marriages are a thing of the past unless religious culture plays into it. But no one is legally bound to marry another. But anyone who has read any book ever or seen any animated Disney movie is aware that marriages were rarely, if ever, based on love and a solid relationship between 2 individuals. Instead, most matches were made to advance a family's standing and financial situation. Oh, you fancy the stable boy who values you as a human being? Tough titties, Georgiana, you're marrying 60-year-old Lord Buxtonley, and God help you if you don't have any sons, because we haven't yet learned that it's the man's chromosomes that determine the gender. Peasants and working class people tended to have more freedom in who they chose to marry, although some families might arrange matches between friends out of convenience. In the time of serfdom, the lord of the land had to approve the match, and despite what some may believe, there is no such ritual as prima nocta, as it was more likely a myth invented in the Victorian era. In the European royal courts, gentry and nobility had matches arranged by the families, but ultimately they had to acquire the permission from their monarch in order to tie the knot. An early form of solidifying a match before an official wedding was this thing known as a pre-contract, which is a verbal or written agreement to marry in the future. 2 individuals could do it themselves, as Catherine Howard and Frances Dereham were believed to have made a pre-contract which dissolved her marriage with Henry VIII, or it could be done on behalf of the couple before they are of consenting age. And when you're of royal blood, whether you're first in line to the throne or 10th, you nonetheless are a representative of your country, and when you marry into another royal family, you represent your home. It would be a gamble as to who you were going to marry. Some families tried to marry as closely within the family as possible to keep their royal bloodlines pure. This is never a good idea. That's how you get severe mental illness, mutants with giant chins, haemophiliac Tsareviches, and wars of succession in Spain. It was mainly daughters who were shipped overseas to never see their homes again, while the second sons would join the church or the army or become advisors to their older brothers. They had more freedom to choose, but they would still be expected to marry royalty. There were times where a princess might defy expectations and either marry for love or to avoid another arranged marriage. Henry VIII's 2 sisters both took second husbands against the wishes of their brother, and the children from both marriages would be involved in the succession struggles following Henry VIII's death. Mary Queen of Scots married Lord Darnley for her own satisfaction, and we all know how well that went. With marriage politics being the way they were, Is it any wonder why Elizabeth I stayed single? From the moment Anna von Kleve was old enough to think about the future, she would have been well aware that it was her destiny to enter into an arranged marriage and produce children who would one day play their part on the world stage of international politics. When her marriage contract to Lorraine was dissolved by her brother, it seemed uncertain that Anna would marry at all. Her sister Amalia didn't marry and became close with her nieces and nephews. There is no source for how Anna felt about her impending marriage to Henry VIII. But I'm sure anyone who was travelling slowly across Europe to marry someone who was known throughout the continent for his less than kind treatment of his wives would be a little nervous. And I doubt the king's ambassadors would have told her about the king's infected leg ulcers or his morbid obesity. We can only imagine what was going through her mind in those weeks spent stranded in Calais, with her husband waiting for her on the other side of the channel. The story you may have heard at school, or just casually, is that when Henry heard that Anna was on her way to London, he couldn't wait to meet the woman whose portrait he had projected all his hopes onto. He and a handful of courtiers rode with all haste to Rochester, doing away with the tradition of having the bride and groom separate until they were officially introduced. The king burst into Anna's chambers when she wasn't ready to receive visitors and saw her face for the first time. He left as quickly as he arrived and stormed back to London, where he confronted Cromwell, claiming that Anna was hideous and looked nothing like her portrait. The narrative has been repeated in almost all her on-screen counterparts. So that's kind of why I can't order this from least to most accurate. Instead, we have the majority that got it wrong, one that was done for comedic purposes, the one that got it right but wasn't 100% what happened, and one that's kind of debatable.
Divorced, beheaded and died.
This was kind of disappointing because Horrible Histories usually gets things so right. I understand that because of the kind of parody they were doing, they had to keep with the whole she looks like a horse narrative, but maybe they didn't need to do that kind of parody. I know the Brits don't watch American reality TV much because ours is far superior, don't change my mind, but hear me out on this. What if it was historical 90 Day Fiancé instead? That way you could have had Henry trying his cosplaying on Anna, and she would equally be allowed to be covered. It would have allowed more comedy between Martha Howe Douglas and Ben Wilbond, who can be incredibly hilarious together. The sketch is just barely tolerable because these actors are in it. If it was anyone else who wasn't from the original Horrible Histories cast, I'd toss it in the bin.
Divorced, beheaded, survived.
Well, here's something. Probably the first negative thing I have to say about this series is how Anna von Kleve was introduced. Mainly because they actually used the horse quote. Side note, we'll get into the horse thing later, just be patient. But they cast an actress who has a notably round face. One could argue that Henry was looking for any excuse to get rid of her because he didn't want the marriage. And once he saw her, he could complain that she didn't look like her portrait. But that isn't exactly consistent with his eagerness to meet her in the previous scene. Could it be because she acts so awkwardly? Perhaps, as Henry is used to women doing exactly what he wants. And even when Anne Boleyn refused him, she always had something clever to say that kept him interested. I like the theory that this Henry simply isn't attracted to women who lack self-confidence. And Anna's shyness from her lack of experience with the outside world meant this marriage was doomed before it started. And plus, she's afraid of him, so it's only after she has been discarded and knows that he won't kill her that she actually manages to be happy with her lot. I don't know, maybe I just wanted to see Jonathan Rhys-Meyers put on a costume with Henry Cavill and watch the scene play out.
I'm Henry VIII, I had 6 sorry wives. Some might say I ruined their lives.
There is nothing to interpret here. It's just stupid. As I said last time, they didn't show the meeting scene between Anna and Henry, and instead skip to afterwards where Henry is bitching to Norfolk about her. I'm sure enough people have said show don't tell so much that you've made a drinking game out of it, but this is the reason that people belt it out in their critiques. It is a sign of a bad writer when they summarise events after the fact that are meant to have a massive impact on the plot. For example, imagine if you were watching The Phantom Menace and all you saw of the Duel of the Fates was Darth Maul igniting his lightsaber and Irish Space Jesus doing this pose, then immediately cut to after the fight with Obi-Wan running into the room and telling everyone that Irish Space Jesus got killed, and then he cut Darth Maul in half and everything's fine now and Obi-Wan is the next Space Jesus. You'd be pretty annoyed, right? All this accomplishes is making your viewers grumpily scroll through Wikipedia to get filled in on the history, and this was before smartphones, so if you're watching this you're like, I have no idea what they're saying, I've got to go and turn my massive desktop computer on, and no one is allowed to use the phone while I check the facts, okay? I'm firmly of the belief that you shouldn't need to have read the book or watched the original or know the history before going into an adaptation, because the adaptation itself should stand on its own, and it will make returning to or discovering the original an interesting experience too. But because the miniseries was desperately plagiarising Anna the Thousand Days, Six Wives of Henry VIII and Henry VIII and his Six Wives, it expected you to have already seen those and go in knowing everything. Personally, if I didn't already know the history, I would have felt like a child thrust into a test I hadn't studied for.
Anne of Cleves came at 4. I fell for the portrait I saw.
Damn, guys. I mean, just damn. This movie is so good and so authentic when it comes to the other wives, but they shaft Anna so royally that it's the one part of the movie I don't like. Have you ever found a burnt crisp or potato chip in your otherwise favourite flavour? It's kind of like that. What I can say in its favour is Keith Michel's performance, as always, because he manages to show that Henry wasn't about to throw a tantrum right in front of Anna. He just composed himself while they were meeting, dismissed himself as soon as possible, and then he saved his anger for Cromwell after they left. Like, you just know if that scene was in Henry VIII 2003, Ray Winston would have just had a massive tantrum right there, would have been like on the floor kicking and screaming like a toddler. I don't want to be mean to Ray Winston. I'm sorry to be mean to Ray Winston. He is a good actor. I've seen Black Widow.
Then laid eyes on her face and cried, she's a horse! I must have another divorce.
This one has the more forgivable context because it was made clear that Anna is trying to sabotage her marriage by scrunching up her face and acting strangely to put Henry off. Henry is also doing this half-heartedly because he's just noticed Catherine Howard at court and would rather have a woman who's right there and he already knows than a German he's never met. So this version of Anna isn't made ugly and there is reluctance on both fronts, but the idea of them both trying to sabotage the marriage before it started seems far more comical and dramatically forgivable than what we've seen so far. I'll save Six Wives and Six the Musical for the next segment. I covered this in the history video, but I'll repeat it here. So yeah, when Henry learned that Anna was at Rochester, he was eager to meet her before he married her. He'd met his last 3 wives years before marrying them after all, but instead of waltzing in there like the Kool-Aid mascot and the Smash Mouth Shrek had morphed with baby avatar Cora, he wanted to reenact a story from his childhood where the gallant suitor dresses identically to his servants, and through the power of love between the hero and his heroine, she would pick him out from the rabble and he would reveal himself. Henry had a bit of a thing for cosplay. When he married Catherine of Aragon, there was an account where he and his friends came bursting into the Queen's apartments dressed as Robin Hood and his merry men. He also partook in a lot of the masks before he messed up his leg in the jousting tournament of 1536. The problem was, Anna came from a court where women weren't allowed to sing, play music or dance because it was improper in their eyes. Therefore, when Anna came to England, she would have only been familiar with German stories told to her by her nursemaids when she was a child. When Henry, who would have been a complete stranger to her, dressed as a servant and kissed her without so much as a by your leave, she would have been rightly disgusted. And when he revealed himself to be the king, it wouldn't have been enough to relieve her embarrassment, so she kept looking out the window at the joust, waiting for him to leave. To Anna, who had just left a strict court that she could rarely show her face in, this would have been the height of rudeness.
'Cause we're Tudors, Britain's biggest feuders, and just like barracudas, we kill with methods foul.
As I said, this was the only version that got their first meeting right, as far as Henry disguising himself and Anna feeling embarrassed. But because of the way Anna was rewritten to be more politically savvy, doing the same thing in this context wouldn't work. Instead, Henry comes in dressed as a servant, and the two of them have some wine together. Henry is impressed with her intelligence and actually seems attracted to her to the point that he starts flirting. Anna, not knowing he's the king, reprimands him, but when he reveals who he is, she's not overjoyed to see him. Instead, she has the far more realistic reaction to realising the whale of a man who just came into your room when you're in your nightgown and started flirting with you is the man you're supposed to marry in a few days' time. Henry is quite rightly humiliated that Anna wasn't pleased to see him. And a man with a bruised ego is very dangerous indeed, as Cromwell can quite rightly see. And while Cromwell goes to pacify the king, Cranmer realises that Anna must not be feeling all that great and goes to comfort her. She sat holding herself with the utter dread of the wedding night. So they changed the context, but they made the existing events work with their narrative. That's how it's done.
Tudors, if ever we are Tudors, at least we're not as rude as Simon Cowell.
So at first I thought this also went with the whole he said I was ugly and that's why he got rid of me thing. But then after 8 billion listens, it occurred to me that there was more to it than that. And this version of Anna is not just dripping with sarcasm, she's swimming in it. As a result, you have to take each line she says or sings with a pinch of salt. She says, "But I didn't look as good as I did in my pic." Funny how we all discuss that, but never Henry's little, "Yes, Anna, it's funny how we all think Henry rejected you because you were ugly, not because he's compensating for something and threw you under the bus as a result." Throughout the show, she never actually admits that she's ugly. Instead, she says that Henry says she's ugly, or that she didn't live up to Henry's expectations. Therefore, it can be argued that Anna isn't at all to blame, and Henry put her on too high a pedestal that reality couldn't possibly reach. Since Anna got a pretty nifty settlement, it doesn't bother her though. Just goes to show, song lyrics mean more than what they say on the tin. A bruised male ego is dangerous, but from a safe distance it's hilarious to watch. And it also explains a lot of the reasons behind some significant events. Aaron Burr, Sir, shot Alexander Hamilton in a duel because Hamilton's support of Thomas Jefferson cost Burr the presidential election of 1800, along with other acts of defamation on Hamilton's part. The Battle of Waterloo saw tens of thousands die because Napoleon Bonaparte jumped off his island and said, "Oi, I ain't going nowhere. You can't counsel me because I tried to invade Russia." Yes, in my head, Napoleon Bonaparte has a Cockney accent, don't ask why. Henry VIII had also been guilty of this. I'm sure you've all heard of the wrestling match at the Field with the Cloth of Gold, where Henry lost the match and sabotaged the alliance that they were all meant to be there to solidify. For centuries, the general belief behind why Henry had disposed of Anna von Kleve is because she was ugly and looked nothing like her portrait. With the celebrations prepared, new royal apartments and specially carved marital bed, it seems Henry had every intention of going through with the wedding. What's more, given that Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour were often described as not great beauties by contemporary sources, Anna von Kleve would have had to look pretty bad for Henry to reject her on first glance. Many accuse Hans Holbein for making Anne's portrait too attractive, and Holbein was mostly in the favour of Thomas Cromwell, so it seems logical that Holbein was doing a solid for his friend and doing whatever was needed to bring the German princess and her Protestant-friendly alliance to England. And then there's that Flanders Mare comment. I've been waiting to say this for a while now, and I'm glad that you have rightly recognised this misconception in the comments. Henry VIII calling Anna von Kleve a Flanders mare is why you should always make sure you separate your sources. There is no contemporary account of Henry calling Anna anything resembling a horse. This comment didn't arise until the 17th century, where an English monarch's abuse of power led to a civil war. Plus, Flanders and Kleve are nowhere near each other, and in different kingdoms. Surely Henry VIII would have known that, being king and all. Hans Holbein, according to the late Sir Ellis Waterhouse, a noted art historian, was one of the first artists who could be considered a realist. Renaissance art was determined to paint portraits that were as close to the model as possible, while also providing an element of the person's interior character within their portrait. If this is to be believed, we can see that quite clearly in his portraits of Jane Seymour, Thomas Cromwell and Henry VIII. He had painted Jane, the most beloved wife, with a distinctive nose and pursed lips, but her serious expression showed she was a queen dedicated to piety and humility, and would therefore want her face to be shown honestly. Cromwell's narrow-eyed stare, his great robes and the Bible on his table presents him as the cunning and religiously motivated man we know him to be. The colourful foreground and background makes him stand out even more thanks to his plain black clothes, which also demonstrates that he was not in this to cover himself with jewels, separating him from the grandeur associated with Catholicism. And of course, Henry VIII's colossal portrait shows him as just that. Henry was unusually tall for his time, and his height and width takes up the canvas. His jewelled clothes show the wealth of him and the nation. His codpiece is, well...
Do you think maybe he's compensating for something?
For Anna, her jewelled clothes are indeed greatly detailed and shows how starkly different the German fashion was from the English and presents her as an immediate outsider. But the jewels would appeal to Henry, as he would want to achieve a wealthy prize for his fourth wife that would not only bring him material wealth, but also wealth in the form of sons. The longer I look at the red dress, red being a colour for fertility and passion, and the shape of her headdress, the more I'm reminded of The Handmaid's Tale, as Henry freely admitted to Charles de Marliac that he only intended to marry Anna for sons. Is it just me? It's probably just me. I'm freely willing to believe that the Anna we see in the Holbein portrait was indeed a close likeness of Anna, and it wasn't her appearance that caused Henry to dislike her. No, history is never that simple. I agree with Lucy Worsley's theory that Henry used Anna as a scapegoat when he was confronted with how old and infirm he had become. When he arrived at Rochester on New Year's Day, he had hoped that he could recapture the tomfoolery of his youth, but Anna's rejection was a smack in the face to him when she didn't realise who he was. He may have been able to brush it off if he was able to sleep with her, but it is possible at this time Henry suffered from impotence owing to his age and poor diet. He lived mostly on meat and carbs, but couldn't do any exercise to work it off, ate off plates made from sugar, and wasn't the kind of guy to eat a nice salad.
Vegetables of the peasant!
Not to mention the fact that water on its own was undrinkable. Nobles would drink ale and wine to avoid the diseases that came with it, and we all know what alcohol does for your performance. But Henry was a very egotistical man, and he would never admit that he was the root of the problem. Nothing was ever his fault. It had to be because of that wife or that advisor. So he spread word that he was having wet dreams, but couldn't do it with Anna because she was fat, smelly and unattractive. Pot, kettle and black spring to mind. Henry unfavourably described Anna to have loose breasts and belly when he failed to consummate the marriage. When he said, "I left her as good a maid as I found her," he was accusing Anna of not having been a virgin when he came to her, and hinted that the looseness of these features were signs of Anna having at least one child. The idea of Anna von Kleve having a secret love child before she was married off to the king is speculative at best and ludicrous at worst. Anna had lived a rigidly supervised life in Kleve and would likely have never come into contact with a man without her parents or personal maid supervising her. The closest thing to a man in her life would have been her brother Wilhelm, who was educated separately from his sisters. This again is likely a part of Henry's scapegoating of Anna to make up for his own shortcomings, topped with a lack of knowledge about women's anatomy. No two bodies are the same. It is completely possible to still be a virgin and have loose breasts and a loose stomach owing to weight conditions or hormones. It is not uncommon when attacking a woman's character, the first target is her external appearance. Henry was used to choosing the woman he went to bed with. He could have chosen any princess when he became king, but his familiarity with Katherine of Aragon meant he'd rather have her. He chose Anne Boleyn, he chose Jane Seymour, he chose every one of his mistresses, along with Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr. Anna von Kleve was a choice made for him at the behest of Cromwell. Anna was quite clearly not Henry's type. Spoilers ahead for the Alison Weir book, Anna von Kleve, Queen of Secrets. But the big secret child plot that the story revolves around is based on how things would go if Anna had indeed had a secret love child. Since Alison Weir asserted that this was meant to be a speculative story, I wasn't about to rip this to pieces. When Henry indeed realises that this version of Anna had had a child, owing to her cousin forcing himself on her when she was 13, Henry is unable to fully accuse her of it, because it would be an insult to Kleve, whose friendship he needs. Hence, no one finds out about it, and he has no solid proof apart from her appearance. It would be very difficult for a woman to hide a pregnancy, given the fashions of the time being form-fitting, and no royal court is without its gossipers. Henry, who probably had far more illegitimate children than Henry Fitzroy, probably didn't take this into account, that it is possible for a man to have multiple children and not know about the parentage, but for a woman it's much trickier. In Britain, there is a great deal of affection and admiration towards Katherine of Aragon, because not only was she Henry VIII's longest queen, but she was amazingly dedicated to refusing Henry's callousness when he tried to dispose of her. But with Anna von Kleve, we're just as guilty of dismissing her as Henry was. However, in her homeland, she's a very popular figure. In Kleve, she actually has a cake named after her to mark the 500th anniversary of her birth. If I want to go and visit Kleve sometime, I can't not go and try the cake. It would be like going to visit Cambridge and not going into Fitzbilly's for a Chelsea bun. I mean, I don't even like Chelsea buns that much, but I would have to because I would have no choice. I think Anna was an incredibly significant figure and deserves to have her story told beyond the few months that she was married to Henry. In a world where history's voice was mostly told through the male gaze and is just now getting a broader female perspective, dismissing Anna as ugly was par for the course. Because who would want to marry an ugly woman? Ew, gross. Let's look at that nymphette he dumped her for. And forgive me for getting a bit real here. I think Anna's story needs to come to light in the wake of the Me Too movement, because the true story behind her and Henry's meeting sounds all too familiar. A man with more power than self-control or awareness puts the moves on a young woman who has turned her entire world upside down and has dedicated herself to living in a new place. She rebuffs the advances because she's uncomfortable, and the man responds by using his influence to blacken her reputation. Women have had their careers ruined before they started because they stood up for themselves and the men didn't like it, and replaced them with women who were more submissive. Anna did luck out in the long term, keeping her head and living independently, but never married again. That's something that should be explored. In the Alison Weir book, it is explained that Anna wanted to marry one of her German servants, but the Privy Council told her that marrying again would cut off the income from the crown, which she desperately needed to maintain her estate. But other possibilities could be that marrying meant signing over her wealth to a man, as a woman would rarely own anything in her own right after she was married. Anna could have been asexual or aromantic by today's standards, but I don't think we'll ever find a contemporary source that confirms it. It is an interesting theory, but nothing can set it in stone. You'll know how much I love Anne Boleyn, but if you were making a new drama in the Tudor era, I don't think we need the umpteenth incarnation of Catherine, Anne and Jane. It wouldn't kill you to try something different and let Anna have the spotlight for once. Anna can't be a love interest, a villain or a powerless victim in need of saving from the dragon, however. How on earth do you write a character like that? I don't know. 6 Wives of Henry VIII got it right. We can do it again. A bit of a break from tradition, but since Anna managed to survive her tenure with Henry VIII, let's take a look at the many estates she acquired, either in the divorce or in exchange for another estate. One thing I enjoy about the UK is that there is no shortage of castles and stately homes from all manner of time periods. Believe me, my family and I have spent many a great day out just going to these places, seeing the estates, going for a cream tea, and, in my case, getting a bookmark from the gift shop. Behold, the bookmark collection. Another reason I go to these places is because either they filmed something you really like there, or it was involved in a chapter of history that you're really interested in. This is what I like to call a nerd's pilgrimage, and it can work for any location for any reason. Are you visiting the island that Luke Skywalker was living on in Star Wars? Nerd's pilgrimage. Vasquez Rocks from Star Trek The Next Generation? Nerd's pilgrimage. Scarborough Cemetery where Anne Bronte is buried? Nerd's pilgrimage. Yes, that's me in the picture. It was taken in July. The next day I was doing another Nerd's pilgrimage in Whitby because of Dracula, and I actually got bitten on the arse by a mosquito. Now I'm a vampire. Anyway, I would suggest that you visit the 2 remaining estates that Anna owned, because they are already rich in history without her. Sadly, not all the estates survive the centuries. Big stately homes easily fall into decay when they aren't regularly maintained. They don't call Cork Abbey the unstately home for nothing. But it is still super nostalgic to me, and a wonderful place for people who like long dark tunnels. Let's start with the estates that didn't survive. I'm sure you already knew this from listening to Six the Musical a billion times. Richmond Palace was built by Henry VII in the new style of dark red brick, rather than plain grey stone of medieval architecture. It was the staple of the Tudor dynasty for some time, and it was no coincidence that this was named for the earldom which Henry VII was known by before becoming king. When it was completed in 1501 with its splendid decoration, it was a high point of his reign, with 2 usurpers defeated, rivals executed, and an impending marriage alliance with the Spanish. By 1540, Richmond Palace had gone out of style and was rarely visited by the court. When Henry VIII sent Anna there, it was in the same manner as sending Katherine of Aragon to the moor. She would not be in a place that the court was likely to visit. Richmond would be Anna's main residence, as being close to the river meant she was free to visit the court whenever she wished, whether they were at Hampton Court or Greenwich. Anna reluctantly relinquished Richmond Palace to Edward VI in 1548, under the excuse that she hadn't maintained it properly. In truth, she had no money to maintain it in the first place. The first and last Tudor monarchs died at Richmond Palace. Remarkably fitting, don't you think? Richmond Palace fell victim to the wrath of Oliver Cromwell and the Roundheads when they dismantled the monarchy. You see this a lot with castles in Britain. If it's in ruins, or if it's not there anymore, blame the Roundheads. All that remains is a gatehouse. Okay, for a while I had somehow missed out a few syllables, so when they said they were giving Anna Bletchingley Place, I actually thought Bletchley Park, you know, the place in Buckinghamshire where Alan Turing did the whole code breaking thingy. And you have no idea how disappointed I was when I found out otherwise, but yeah, that does make sense, because I actually went to Bletchley Park in 2017, and surely I would have noticed something Anna of Cleves related. Bletchingley Place itself was originally a medieval manor house, and the 3 previous owners before Anna had been executed for treason. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, lost his head in 1485. Followed by his son Edward, who was executed in 1521, and Sir Nicholas Carew in 1539. It was modified with red brick and had 2 hunting parks. So this house was rather a generous gift on Henry VIII's part. Anna stayed there often, but was ordered by Edward VI in 1547 to increase her income by renting it to a tenant, as the Crown wished to provide for Anna as little as possible. Bletchingley was demolished in 1680. The gatehouse still stands, but it has a modern interior, and Place Farm now sits on the foundations of the house. The moor was one of many estates belonging to Cardinal Wolsey. Like Hampton Court Palace, Wolsey used his wealth and influence to make it as lavish as possible. After he died, all his properties were seized by the Crown. This was the first place where Katherine of Aragon was sent after she was banished from court in 1530. When Anna von Kleve received it as part of the settlement, it was also used by the court in 1542 for Privy Council meetings. This place would be an ideal location to isolate from spikes of plague, but still close enough to London in order to do business. There aren't many accounts of Anna staying there. Before the end of the Tudor era, it was already in ruins and was finally demolished in 1661. No trace of it remains today. This residence was granted to Anna by Edward VI in exchange for Richmond Palace. Henry VIII had it built between 1541 and 1544. It was built on top of the Dartford Priory, another monastery which Henry had demolished. For all its glory, its 100 rooms and carved Tudor roses, you guessed it, demolished. I know this sounds silly, but it is sad that these relics aren't still standing. All the nerds' pilgrimages one cannot possibly have because they're not there anymore. It's so sad. The 2 surviving estates are... Okay, so you've heard of this one. Yes, this was Anne Boleyn's childhood home, and we associate this place with her and the Boleyn family. So how did Anna come to own it? Well, when Thomas Boleyn died in 1539, he had no son to pass his estate on to, on account of the whole execution thing. And I don't think Mary Boleyn or her children were going to fight the king on this. So the castle passed to the Crown, and it was still in pretty good condition. When Anna was staying there, she received the Lady Elizabeth as a guest at least once, and Henry also came to visit her. It was redecorated in the early 20th century into the castle we know today. So if Anna von Kleve and Anne Boleyn were to walk through it today, they probably wouldn't recognise it. And finally, the filming location for literally every pre-Civil War period piece ever. This was another asset that the Crown had seized from the Staffords when the Duke of Buckingham was beheaded. Anna only owned it for a brief time during Edward VI's reign, but its proximity to London made it a useful location, since she no longer had Richmond Palace. In 1552, Edward VI relinquished it and gave it to Sir William Sidney, grandfather to the poet Philip Sidney. The place has belonged to the Sidney family ever since. Unfortunately, because Hever Castle and Penshurst are still privately owned estates, one cannot simply walk in with a National Trust or English Heritage membership and not actually have to pay the entrance fee, in which case it is a tad pricey to get in, so keep that in mind if you want to visit them someday. For those of you who don't know what the hell I'm talking about, with the National Trust and English Heritage, they are two charities that conserve British history and their most notable site. You can either pay for a membership for a whole year in advance, or you can do a direct debit and you will be able to go to any property that they own within the British Isles and just show them your membership card, and you get to go in. You don't have to pay the entrance fee because you've already paid for it. But if you don't have that, then you have to pay the entrance fee, or at least pay for parking. I want an Anna von Kleve movie more than I want a season 4 of Ghosts, but I think that when it comes, it's going to be German made and I'll have to read it at my local art house cinema, and not many will care because some people are just too lazy to read movies. You know, if there's a studio out there that wants to do an Anna von Kleve movie or TV series, I am available to do the script. I'd write it specifically from the start of Anna's story until the end, or alternatively, I know I swore off The Crown unless I get like 1 million subscribers where I'll do a rankings video on Liz II, but if we could get a Tudors version of The Crown, I'd like to help. I'm just saying. But it would be strictly from the perspectives of all 6 wives, where it would begin with Catherine of Aragon and then we would phase into Anne Boleyn when Catherine becomes queen, and then Catherine Parr can be actually there and we can see her go through her 2 marriages and sort of be separated from the main events at court, like Daenerys in Game of Thrones. So that way you can introduce Anna von Kleve long before she arrives in England. And like The Crown, you would be recasting the actors as they age, so you wouldn't have to worry too much about contracts. This is viable and it wouldn't be hard to make. Another thing I'd like to see is how the religious schism born from Edward VI's reign takes an emotional toll on the royal family. Elizabeth, the middle child, is already torn between her siblings and her faith. Imagine her turning to Anna for consolation and establishing how much the Reformation has destroyed all trust among the younger generation of the Tudor dynasty. My advice for Catherine of Aragon was to give her more time to shine and develop, but keep within character. With Anne Boleyn, the least you can do is try not to fall into old stereotypes. With Jane Seymour, I thought she at least deserved a chance to be ruthless. And with Anna von Kleve, I just want you guys to have fun. I want you to take some new perspective, not tread the same beats because it's what the audience expects. When you go with the flow, you're quicker to be forgotten. If you do something different and do it well, people will remember you. And that concludes my coverage on Anna von Kleve. I don't know when we can expect another on-screen incarnation of her outside of a documentary reenactment. Hopefully, by the time Becoming Elizabeth is released, I won't have done my Catherine Parr rankings yet. It's a shame that there is nothing to look forward to when it comes to Anna, because I think the backlash against some of the more recent Tudor dramas has made it harder for people to look forward to one. The best we can hope for is that the Becoming Elizabeth series is watchable, and that the BBC will finally get off their keisters and make the second series of Wolf Hall. And just saying, I also think I deserve a medal for not accidentally saying Joss Whedon as Anna von Kleve in my rankings video, because I was literally second guessing myself whenever I was saying Joss Stone. Let's hope that in the next rankings video I won't say Tamsin Greig as Catherine Howard. All I can say now is I hope that this isn't the last we'll see of Anna von Kleve.
So sorry there wasn't a more positive thing to end on there, as there was with, because
honestly, I don't know when we're going to see Anna von Kleve again. I was going to do this bit in front of the camera, but I thought I'd get ahead of things and film myself a few days in advance. But I look back at the footage and it's just awful. Basically, the footage I filmed was too dark lighting-wise because I have a south-facing room, so the sun was like right in, but then I had to block a bit out, and then half of the other room was in darkness. It just didn't go well, so we'll work it out next time. But fortunately, thanks to my lovely patrons, I can now start saving for better equipment, and I'm hoping that I can do more in front of the camera stuff. So, in a weird segue, thank you to all my patrons for your amazing support, especially to my VIP patrons Anastasia Gracia, Alison Cuff and Larissa. Thank you all so much. And I am looking forward to Katherine Howard as much as you are, which will start on next month, as I'm going to spend the final week of September working on 10 videos that are going to be coming out in October to celebrate Black History Month, and calling it Black History Matters Month. It's going to be a series of about famous African American, Afro-Caribbean, Afro-English, Afro-British people who don't have a movie about them, or if they do have a movie about them, it's not very good, or they feature in historical fiction movies and other media a lot, but they're not the actual main characters, they're just side characters. So, if you're interested in that, and if you're looking forward to Katherine Howard, please make sure you subscribe and hit the bell, and please leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Thank you guys so much.